thank you, Katrina. She didn't say how very hard I tried to persuade her not to invite me and how many efforts I made to get out of coming, for which I now apologize, though who knows, I may have been right. I'm also impressed that so many people have turned out for what must promise to be an evening of unrelenting pessimism, which is what you're going to get, beautifully symbolized by what appears to be a painting of people kicking each other in the head on the ceiling. The actual title that I was asked to speak to was not God, Liberty and the Future of Europe, but God, Liberty and the Worrying Future of Europe, which is even worse. But I was also warned by Katrina that I should speak for as long as possible so I could prevent you lot from saying too much, which is why I have here this Fidel Castro-style long oration, which I shall now begin. And first, I must thank you so much for inviting me to this beautiful maritime city, crammed with beauty and with history. And on that point, I am well aware that Britain's contribution to that history has not always been wholly positive. My countrymen, including our national hero, Admiral Horatio Nelson, have an unpleasant habit of doing great damage and destruction whenever they come here. I'm hoping that I shan't be repeating any of that this evening and shall try very hard not to. We have also, we British, done that dreadful thing which we habitually do to friendly nations on the continent. We have pledged to come to your aid against the Germans in time of trouble. Given the way this worked out for Belgium in 1914, almost totally occupied and plundered for 4 long years, and Poland in 1939, wiped off the map and subsequently moved bodily westward by 100 miles and subjected to 40 years of communist oppression, I think you should be grateful that we didn't come to your aid in 1864 and that Lord Palmerston blatantly broke his promises. And we British did not, in fact, save you from the Prussians. I would much rather be a betrayed Dane of 1864 than a saved Belgian of 1914, or let alone a saved Pole of 1939. But in general, my country's history, protected by a few short but rough miles of salt sea, has given it a snobbish and scornful view of less happy lands. Please forgive me if I show any traces of this in what I say about the current state of Europe. It is unintentional, but perhaps unavoidable. In my view, we in Britain praise our own courage and resolve far too much and give thanks for the sea far too little. Of course, you may also need a navy to make full use of the sea's defences, but we have now so forgotten our history in Britain that we have scrapped most of ours. Who knows what terrible things we might have undergone and what terrible things we might yet undergo had we not been saved from trouble by the English Channel, and particularly in the future with no navy, what lies ahead of us. Mr. Churchill did a brave and right thing when he refused to negotiate with Germany in 1940 and instead threw himself on the interesting mercy of the United States of America, but without the sea he would not have had the choice. That's it as far as Churchillian bombast is going to go this evening. I'm as patriotic as most Englishmen and more patriotic than many, but I must warn you that if you are hoping for any sort of Churchillian rallying cry against the new menaces that face us tonight, you're in for a disappointment. I have largely given up direct engagement in politics. British politics, I have found, is entirely tribal and wholly hostile to reason. In fact, it is angered by reason and closes its mind to such reason with a self-righteous certainty, which is horrible to see. That is why I personally abandoned direct political activity and declared myself to be what I now am, the obituarist of my country. There I was, a national newspaper columnist, with an enviable access to a large number of minds. And I could do nothing, absolutely nothing, to avoid the perils or halt the follies which I could clearly see and describe, and for which there were straightforward remedies available. In the past few years, I've found it harder and harder to maintain any political stance at all, and cannot really offer you any comfort or encouragement of that sort this evening. In fact, the most cheerful prospect I can offer you is the possibility that I may be wrong. I am sure that you will both think and hope that I am wrong, especially by the end of this evening. Paradoxically, I am personally much happier since I found I could do nothing. A huge and troubling responsibility has fallen from my shoulders, and I found a great deal of personal comfort in the consolations of the Christian religion and the glorious expression of it in poetry, painting, music, and architecture, so much of which still survives despite the terrible century through which we have just passed. But politically, Christianity offers me little. After all, what is actually left of Christianity in our culture? In Britain, there is little sign that the clergy believe in God, let alone anybody else. The arches which hold up our civilization were made to Christian designs and built around Christian frames, but they will stand now for only so long as they continue to be stronger than the malicious power of gravity and decay pushing down upon them. They are not being renewed or repaired. The forces which raised them no longer exist. It is the oddest paradox of our times that governments of formerly Christian Western nations, when they seek to rouse their populations to war, attack Islamist movements, whether the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or Daesh, because they allegedly, or maybe in fact, hate our way of life. Ladies and gentlemen, I also hate our way of life. Often for reasons alarmingly similar to the passions of Muslims. I loathe the destruction of marriage and the family, the coarseness and immodesty of our culture, and the widespread indifference to, sometimes fanned into scorn for, the idea that we owe anything to God. Yet I am also alarmed by the arrival of Islam in our societies, mainly through large-scale immigration, encouraged by the very same politicians who say these things about how Muslims hate our way of life. The arrival of Islam is a major moral and cultural force in Britain and large parts of Europe because of the mass immigration which our elites have, not in my view, not failed to resist, but have actively encouraged. How did Christianity, which ought in these times to be our most reliable defense against this problem, crumble so fast? How did Christian Europe fail so totally? For fail, it certainly did. In my father's early childhood, before 1914, Christianity was as essential to English life as, say, good broadband is now. I suspect it was much the same here. Now it is an eccentricity. For me, Europe had a moment of choice in 1914. As Germany sought a swift, decisive victory in its cynical war against Russia, a war which it had planned for years and carefully provoked, the populations of the great powers went collectively mad. They rushed enthusiastically into a conflict they were falsely told was a great war for civilization. These are the actual words inscribed on my great-uncle Harry's medal, identical to those given to millions in 1918. He was at what we in Britain call the Battle of Jutland in 1916, by the way. My late father's equivalent medal, partly his reward for being at the Battle of North Cape in 1943, finally arrived in a plastic box last year, 73 years after that battle and 30 years after my father had died. But you can never, ever beat British bureaucracy in its slowness in rewarding courage and resolution. It doesn't say anything about a great war for civilization, perhaps because of the awkward problem that an alliance with Joseph Stalin couldn't really be a war for civilization as such. It is even quite awkward to try to describe it as a war against barbarism, so there are no words. Just a depiction of the British lion trampling on the German eagle, as I remember. The churches, for the most part, endorsed the 1914 war as a modern crusade, and so, with some noble exceptions, did the social democratic parties of Europe, who, in my view, were the other great moralistic and idealistic force of the pre-1914 continent. Now, it seems to me, almost entirely gone. Pagan patriots, such as the English poet Rupert Brooke, with his ghastly verses about, I'm going to read this because it's so awful. Now God be thanked who has matched us with his hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping with hand made sure, clear eye and sharpened power to turn as swimmers into cleanness leaping. Yes, he actually wrote that in 1914 about the coming war. Only people such as Rupert Brooke, who I believe to be a pagan in this matter, welcomed the conflict more consistently. And what God, I wonder, was he thanking in those verses? Those who had to fight quickly saw the truth. Rats devouring the corpses of their comrades within feet of where they ate their meals. The absolute corruption and destruction of all the gentle morals that they had been taught in their Victorian and Edwardian upbringings. A total end of civilization as such surrounding them. And at Christmas 1914, Christian Europe flickered into flame for the last time, in my view, when British and German soldiers, reminded of their common Christianity by the hymns of the Nativity, climbed from their trenches and embraced each other. An event which still seems to me to be one of the greatest historical events of all time. They should then have walked home, all of them, in an unstoppable mass rejection of folly, and so saved Europe from what was to come, which was, of course, Lenin, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. But they did not, and the 20th century turned out as it did instead. And when the illusion that the 1914 war was a great war for civilization collapsed in the great nations, and when the horrible costs of the war in death, maimings, bereavement, headless families, and general demoralization became clear, the churches, along with all other instruments of moral authority from the former society in the European nations, began to shrivel. They also, I believe, shriveled in the neutral nations, untouched as they were by the war, because it was so vast and so unavoidable and so total that all Europe felt it, and all European empires. Only the USA, strangely enough, was immune from it. Stefan Zweig's account of pre-1914 Vienna, which many of you will have read in his book The World of Yesterday, is strenuously critical of the era which he describes. He depicts this period as a stifling and stuffy time of repression and rigid education in which the young fell under the rule of the old. And I have no doubt there is a great deal of truth in what he says. My own childhood still had echoes of the same thing, but is he not also an unreliable narrator? This was a world in which, for instance, violence and open lust were shocking, and displays of bad manners and drunkenness a scandal. People actually found them physically distressing. No doubt all of us in this room would regard such a society as oppressive, even repressive. Radicals would also point out that beyond the borders of the middle class, violence and lust and drunkenness were very much present. And yet this was an example of human self-restraint, individual self-government, the placing of chains upon one's own desires, as urged by Edmund Burke, as the alternative to having them placed upon us by the state. I've learned over many years that there is no utopia, that one must choose between options which are unattractive in different ways. In the end, I prefer the restrained and stifling society of self-control, as described by Zweig, to the explosion of what I call selfism, the pursuit of total personal autonomy, which first stirred in the pre-1914 era but grew in strength in the disillusioned landscape of post-1919 Europe, and now, to a great extent, rules us all. Why did Christianity fail what may have been its greatest test? I think it was, in fact, much weaker than it looked in 1914. It had been corrupted by its own success. For Christian societies, especially in my view Protestant ones, bring material well-being to those who embrace their spiritual comforts. John Wesley, the man who re-Christianized a largely godless England in the 18th century and so made the Victorian era possible, knew that where Christianity succeeds, it can also prepare its own destruction. He wondered if, true scriptural Christianity has a tendency, in process of time, to undermine and destroy itself. For wherever true Christianity spreads, it must cause diligence and frugality, which in the natural course of things must beget riches. And riches naturally beget pride, love of the world, and every temper that is destructive of Christianity. And I think this is true. The proud tower, which was pre-1914 Europe, was a tower of gold, and it was that which made it heedless of its moral fate. Of course, by our standards, it was in many ways materially poor, but by those of all the previous centuries, it was extraordinarily rich. And here is the interesting thing. This age of riches is now coming to an end. Though two catastrophic wars have destroyed pre-1914 Europe's moral codes, devalued its education, swept away much of its sense of place and permanence, reduced to rubble a great part of its art and architecture, churned up its landscape, and transformed its music. And just as a side thought here, will we ever grasp just how important music is to civilization? And has there ever been a better illustration of this than the era of rock, in which the thump and twang and howl of Mick Jagger has defined a whole moral, or perhaps you could say immoral, universe, in total opposition to, say, Bach or Palestrina? Has there ever been such a contrast? And yet we let it pass almost unnoticed in our daily lives. They have, in the end, all these changes delivered a superficial prosperity. People have plenty of stuff. They have plenty to eat. Even the poor are rich by the standards of 1914, and rich also by the standards of Africa today. You have to go a long way east in Europe now to find anything resembling the poverty of the era before the Great War, in cities or in countryside. Or so it has been. But the end of the Cold War, the end of the division of Europe, which actually suited the Western half rather well, rather better than it ever admitted, threatens that. We made a devil's bargain with Stalin at Yalta for peace and prosperity and a firmly closed border with the East, in return for giving him absolute power over the people unlucky enough to dwell in his defensive zone. We may not have liked the Prague Putsch, or the Slansky trials, or the crushing of the Berlin Workers' Revolt, or the flattening of the Hungarian Revolution, or the extinction of the 1968 Prague Spring, or the Polish state of emergency. But we let them happen. We made it embarrassingly clear that, despite our claims of having fought Hitler because he was wicked, our love for democracy, freedom, and truth was in fact an internal, complacent one. I'm sure this hypocrisy, which was seldom admitted at the time and is seldom admitted now, made us even more demoralized in the true sense of the word than we were before. Here I speak most directly of my own country, though I believe similar things are happening elsewhere in Western Europe and the USA. Real poverty is now slipping back into our lives. Welfare states wither under the pressure of inflation, which is targeted on those without assets, and so understated in official measures. Governments are less and less able to meet their obligations through taxation, yet are afraid to reduce these obligations and resort to dangerous levels of inflationary borrowing instead. Devalued educational qualifications guarantee nothing. Job security vanishes. Pensions become unaffordable. Governments, while refusing to admit this is what they're doing, and either claiming that the migrants are refugees or pretending to try to control migration, or both, encourage mass movement of people to create cheap labour to keep wages low, and leave their indigenous poor to cope with the resulting strain on housing, education, healthcare, transport, and social services. But in my country, this is an even bigger problem. My country also encourages immigration because without it, much of the unskilled work of our society would simply not be done. Listen to this list of British government mistakes. An egalitarian dogma which has destroyed education for the poor. A welfare system that refuses to distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving. de facto legalization of marijuana, the abandonment of any controls on alcohol, a selfish destruction of lifelong marriage, fatherhood, and family life. Just a few examples, there are others I could come up with given time. These have produced a huge new layer of ill-educated and tragically unemployable people who cannot reasonably be expected to do any work. And they do not. And those migrants who do the cheap labour are, as always, pitiable in their exploited ignorance. But many of them are also amazed in my country at the strange inability and unwillingness of local young men and women to do the work they have come to do, and by the inability of the host country to enforce its borders and its migration rules. I've observed this. I know it to be true. It has happened to Britain. It may have happened to you, but it certainly has happened to Britain. It's in the past. It's not about to happen. You may protest against it in Britain if you wish, but it will do you no good. And the Christian has another problem. He absolutely must do what he or she can to try to make this mess work. We didn't choose this. I think it was a grave mistake. But it would be a still graver mistake to do anything which might make it worse. This is one of the problems with Christianity. Its adherents are quite simply prevented from taking certain sorts of political actions, especially any which might reasonably be expected to lead to cruelty or persecution. The people who have come among us are here. We must be kind to them. But the liberals and the open borders neoconservatives are not pleased with or happy to apply the necessary second half of this proposition. This is yours and mine, Europe as a whole, a Christian society from its foundations up. Though, as I pointed out earlier, it will only remain so for a short while as things are. Those who come to live in it should be expected to accept this in practice. Like any other guest in another's house, they should adapt to the rules of the house, not demand that the house changes its rules to suit them. But alas, the terrible problem of our age then reappears. Our societies are attractive to migrants and agreeable in many ways because they used to be Christian. They will continue to be so for a few years yet, as Christian habits of thought take some time to die out. So the migrants, paradoxically, have come here for benefits which their own arrival, unless they are encouraged to integrate, will help to dilute and destroy. But who will encourage them to integrate? Our governments no longer believe in any of the principles on which our societies are based. They believe instead in a subjective and largely meaningless thing called human rights. Old-fashioned political conservatism in European and American societies has almost completely disappeared. It has been replaced by an aggressive Thatcherism or Reaganism, always indifferent to and often quite hostile to the marriage-based deferred gratification morality of social conservatism. Among the strongest supporters, for instance, of marijuana decriminalisation in Britain is a body called the Adam Smith Institute, which dares to name itself after that great economist. It is crammed with keen young Thatcherites. It constantly produces material calling for the legalisation of marijuana. I have renamed it the Adam Spliff Institute. And it has not been particularly unhappy with this renaming. The Cato Institute in the United States takes a similar view of this particular aspect of selfism or libertarianism, as this strand of thought boastfully and, in my view, moronically calls itself. Many of those, and in this I rather include the Murdoch media, who claim to be disturbed by the arrival of large numbers of Muslims in our midst, are also keen supporters of the open borders which this libertarianism favours. The backers of anti-extremist school programs, of powerful secret police, of overpowering security services to track terrorists, the friends of the surveillance and identity card state, are the same people as the ones who say that they want open borders. Worse yet, they are the same as the ones who have repeatedly supported crazed wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya and Syria, which have stimulated so much of the movement of people which we now face. Then there is the very strange transformation of the left, a left to which I used to belong. Old-fashioned social democrats were often highly socially conservative, because so were their voters. And their voters were highly socially conservative because they knew very well the value of social conservatism for a good life and an honest place if you weren't rich enough to buy your way out of crime and trouble and chaos. They were in favour of marriage, of disciplined education, of properly enforced laws. Who suffers worst from disorder and crime? The working poor, of course. They were often straightforwardly patriotic and almost invariably suspicious of large-scale immigration. Who speaks for them now? In Britain, much of the Labour Party began among Methodists, Christians, very serious Christians, who followed the social gospel of the same John Wesley I mentioned earlier. Yet there is now absolutely no sign of this once huge political force in the British Parliament. Only a last faint echo of it in the large Labour vote for leaving the European Union at our referendum last year, which actually swung the result. The old Marxist left have become Euro-communists, cultural revolutionaries, uninterested in the working class, and reconciled to the continued existence of capital, provided they can regulate it. Capital, in turn, is uninterested in conservatism and is happy to cooperate in political correctness of all kinds, which suits its desire for an unlimited supply of cheap and pliable labour. How shall we in the West now compete with the sweatshops of Shanghai and Canton? Why? By driving mothers out of the home and into the workforce, and by flinging wide our borders to all who come, so that we too can have sweatshops here in Copenhagen and in London too. Meanwhile, China has proved once and for all that you can have prosperity and economic growth of a kind without political and intellectual freedom. The great hope of the 1990s, at the end of Chinese communism and the arrival of prosperity and capitalism in that country would bring freedom, has been one of the most totally broken of our times. Is all this because we have tacitly accepted that the future will look far more like China, a country which, for some reason, few yet have come around to fearing, than it will look like America, of which we increasingly despair? Is it possible that we spend so much energy on attacking repression in Russia, a country we are not truly afraid of, if we have any sense, and which is no real threat to us, but serves as a useful bogeyman into which to deflect our shame at bowing to the real menaces of China and Saudi Arabia? I sometimes wonder whether this is the reason for this curious form of madness. In many ways, the new world before us looks worryingly like the weird joint child of Margaret Thatcher, Timothy Leary, and Deng Xiaoping. Its loins free, its economy liberated, while its drugged mind is set on passivity and pleasure and regulated by internet conformism. It all begins to resemble Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the most accurate dystopian prediction of them all, far surpassing Orwell. Who needs thought police when people have come to love their own servitude? In this century, the philosophers have so far changed the world. Now, it seems to me, the point is to understand it. I have sought this evening to explain how my own preoccupations with the abolition of history, the destruction of religion, the use of legal and illegal drugs to create passivity, the failure of conservatism to combat or reverse cultural and moral revolution, the crises of interventionist war and mass immigration, have a common thread. I am, however, too lucky. I was privileged to see the end of the previous civilization. I am not uncritical of it, and I know very well that it is dead and gone. The past will not come back. But I also know that it possessed virtues which have entirely vanished from the world we now live in. And it is perhaps because I can see no way of restoring those virtues that, like Rod Dreher, I feel forced by my own thoughts into a retreat from combat. I can easily imagine finding some island or mountain fastness and hiding there until the storms are over, trying to keep a feeble flame of enlightenment alive. To fight the monsters and dragons of the new world, you need a belief, not just that the present is all wrong, I can help you with that, but that the future might be better. And in that, I'm afraid, I have to leave you entirely on your own.